Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, and to talk about the races most in need of a rework in some way, shape or form. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Vampire Coast. In terms of campaign mechanics, they're in a pretty decent spot. They earn an enormous amount from sacking and looting settlements to ridiculous level. You can make tens of thousands of gold by sacking settlements. It is a bit ridiculous. Their settlements aren't necessarily great, as they do have a fairly limited amount of income that they can earn from them. However, they more than make up for this with pirate coves, which can gain them quite a bit of income themselves and research rate, as well as an improvement in trade tariff. So their economy is in a pretty good spot. Not good enough to maintain more than a couple of armies, but they don't need it because their campaign really is about going along the coast, raiding them, sacking them, creating pirate coves, and moving on to the next target. Okay, but what's the problem with the Vampire Coast? Because although they do have pretty decent campaign mechanics, they do have one major glaring issue, and that is with regards to the battle. First off, let's say it, their situation when it comes to auto-resolve is just not good. Now consider an army like this. It's not necessarily the best, but it does have some of the top tier units. It's got Necrofexes, Depth Guard, Carronades, and Mortars. A pretty good army. This kind of army in any faction, let alone what Noctilus himself has. He has the Sword of Cain, which I just recently picked up in this campaign. He has deck gunners, high tier units. Like, you would assume an army that this would absolutely crush everything in its path in auto-resolve. And if we were talking about the similar tier army for any other faction or many other factions, they would. But for whatever reason, the Vampire Coast does extremely poorly in auto-resolve. I think the auto-resolve is just not counting the proper power of artillery, or in the case of the Vampire Coast, the special abilities that you do get from your limited horde armies. You do have regular armies, but then you also have horde armies, certain horde armies for legendary lords and legendary admirals, of which there are a select few you can recruit through research. And this can give you substantial buffs in a battle, but it's not really counting that power. I think the auto-resolve puts too much emphasis on numbers and strength of certain units, and it doesn't count the strength of heroes, lords, faction buffs, etc. properly as it should. But that's a whole discussion that could be had. But for whatever reason, the auto-resolve doesn't treat the Vampire Coast very well. That is a problem in its own right. Beyond that, however, is how they actually play in a battle scenario. For this, I want to go to the Galleon Graveyard, where I have a lot of structures, and I want to talk about the units that they do have. And here's going to be one of the bigger problems that the Vampire Coasts do face. They do have incredibly good tier 2 artillery. It's not grudge throwers in terms of artillery to artillery action or against towers, but the mortars are absolutely going to demolish units if they hit. And the AI is expert at dodging mortar shells to a degree that I don't think any human being would be able to. I mean, certainly not in a very intensive battle where there's a lot of things going on, and the AI is still capable of dodging a lot of the shells being fired by mortars. So that's a problem. Their effectiveness is limited. It actually creates a situation, you want to get mortars because if they hit, they're hitting as hard as a hell cannon, actually. But the problem is actually landing those hits, and weirdly enough, you actually end up in a situation where you're better at sieging walled settlements where the units will dock on the wall than you are fighting minor settlement battles as the Vampire Coast. Yeah, a weird, really bizarre fucking situation. But their artillery is pretty good, with the exception of the fact that their top tier, quote-unquote, artillery, or from this line, are the deck gunners, which are incredibly weak. They have good range, but they just fall like potatoes when it comes to any kind of range fire. And that highlights one of the big issues. The Vampire Coast is a ranged faction, predominantly. That's what they're focused on in this, in the basic military tree over here, when we're talking about the Rusty Pistol Trove. And in their artillery line, they are heavily focused on range. And the Necrofix Colossi as well. The problem is that every single one of their ranged units, and their units in general, are very vulnerable to missile fire. Now, this might be a particular problem when you're playing against the High Elves, as I am here in this specific campaign. That might be a particular issue because of the real significant power that the Elves do have, especially because of their range, because they do have incredible range on their basic archers of 180, and they do have a significant amount of missile strength, so it might be a bigger issue in certain campaigns more so than others, though you're gonna have it with 2 of the legendary lords out of 4. But you are incredibly vulnerable to range. Now you might say, well, why don't you just use melee units and monster units? Because you do have that, and hell, Deathwatch have been buffed. Yeah, they have been buffed, but if I were to hazard a guess, I haven't compared stats one-on-one, but the way I view Depth Guard is they're basically on the tier of Chaos Warriors of Khorne, or Chaos Warriors with Halberds, the polearm version. The polearm version is of tier 5 unit, by the way, to be perfectly clear on that. So there are issues with that. They're still, even though they're armored, they're still incredibly vulnerable against range units. That's because, well, they only have 15% missile resistance, which isn't good enough. But the real problem is that the substantial portion of your roster, the zombies in particular, because that's what you're really using for much of your infantry, it's zombies, essentially. Zombie pirate deckhands, which are just basically zombies with different kind of weapons in the vampire counts. They're all very, very vulnerable to range. That's because they all have very low armor, if you look at the values over there. Right, so they all have incredibly low armor, which makes them incredibly vulnerable to ranged. And this also highlights one of the bigger problems that currently exist in battles right now. Any gunpowder unit is going to struggle immensely in those minor settlement and siege battles because they just won't shoot. Virtually all of the siege battles, and most of the game I haven't had the Necrofex Colossi stack. Over here, I was using deck gunners, or some other units, like for instance, for a long time I had the hand cannons. The problem is that even if you do get them in a settlement, beyond the fact that they're going to take an incredible amount of range damage, like, yeah, they're just a little better than Savage Orcs, except Savage Orcs have significant benefits in their own right. And if you're playing as Warzag, you can get 30% missile resistance on individual units, and they are incredibly good in melee. You don't really have that kind of firepower. They're not quite as vulnerable, but they're still pretty vulnerable. Now, if we look at the research, maybe I've missed it, but when it comes down to the research, and I've certainly unlocked a lot, when we look at the research, there doesn't seem to be anything to really buff that to a substantial amount from what I've been able to see. Maybe I've gotten it wrong. My experience with the Vampire Coast is certainly limited. Yeah, you could get the physical resistance, sure, but that's for Prometheans. So there are issues. The problem is also that the range on these units is fairly limited. Like the Zombie Pirate Gunnery mob only has a range of 113, and that's buffed, by the way. Yes, the handgunners can get 180, buffed with all the ranks, and upgrades that I've acquired in the Legendary Lord skills. But just keep in mind, that's the baseline for Elven Archers, which if you're playing as Noctilus, you're going to be facing a lot. And Elven Archers, needless to say, don't have the same problems with line of sight. Gunpowder units, for every race that has them, be it Skaven, Empire, Dwarves, Cafe, they all struggle in being able to get shots, which in a game that's currently so heavily focused on minor settlement and siege battles, as Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires is, gives them significant disadvantages. So I think the Vampire Coast certainly has a battle problem. Can you play them? Can you make do with them? Yeah, you abuse mortars, you abuse artillery, you get monster units, and you get powerful heroes. You can win battles, but it is genuinely incredibly frustrating playing them because much of your freaking roster is just plain useless. I mean, even the monsters themselves, I mean, the Rotting Prometheans are an exception, but they're a higher tier unit. There are some exceptions to the rule, but the lack of armor and missile resistance really, really hurts them. and it's very easy to lose entire units, regardless of what those units are, which, yeah, is a problem, especially when you're dealing with elves. Can you deal with it? Yeah, you can, but that doesn't mean it's not a problem. I would say things would be better if the gunpowder situation wasn't as is, but because they're so heavily focused on gunpowder and they don't have any like archer or crossbow unit, they do suffer far more than pretty much any other faction. Like Skaven have really good options from the very start to deal with minor settlement siege battles, and even though their weapon teams suck just as much, and are just as vulnerable, they do have flexibility when it comes to that. Your flexibility is you only get really good options toward the late game, and that means that your early game battles are going to be incredibly difficult to deal with, just because the way the race is designed at the moment. Need some rebalancing for the campaign, I feel. The second race I want to talk about here is Kislev. Kislev is in a hard spot on the campaign map at the moment, but that is just as much to the geography, being surrounded by legendary lords, as it is about the race, though the race certainly isn't in a great spot. Just to look at the situation, Kislev has several major cities. There's Kislev itself, controlled by Catherine, Prague, and Erengrad, controlled by Castalten. But however, the problem is that they're smaller provinces, the Oblast, Troll Country, etc., they are only with minor settlements. And this, by the way, applies to anyone that takes control over them. It's not just Kislev who has minor settlements here, it's things like the Skaven, which obviously limits significantly what you can do with them. So the actual provinces of Kislev aren't that great. But that's something you can throw under geography, but it is something I feel should be improved upon, because it makes a lot of these smaller provinces pretty much useless. In fact, I've given Troll Country to Catherine after I conquered it. I conquered it here, took out Elpit, took out Frot, took out Azazel, and I'm basically just controlling Erengrad and Alexandrinov, though I'm also helping Krakadrak deal with their problems with Trog. And by the way, I am winning the supporter race by a landslide playing as Castalten. This, by the way, highlights some of the issues. This meter right here will look very different if you're playing as Catherine. Just gives you an idea how much easier of a time Castalten has in terms of getting supporters. But what is the issue with Kislev? Well, the first one is with the invocations themselves. This and the supporter system. Winning supporters is crucial to winning the campaign, because it gives you a lot of control, leadership, diplomatic relations with other Kislev faction. The leadership is actually going to be one of the more important things, though the control is also going to matter if you're not playing Catherine, because you're not going to have the substantial amount of control she gets. So you're going to need that control by winning the supporter race on every level. Especially winning it at level 1 is crucial, but it's also pretty brutal if you're playing Catherine. If you're playing Boris Ursus, you can throw supporters to whoever you want once you get to 50, so you can give them to either Castalten for control or growth to Catherine, but it is temporary and it's not a permanent buff. Either way, however, the supporter system is awful. It's just plain freaking awful. I always had misgivings with the rivalry that Hector and Paris had in a Total War Saga train. This is basically copying that. But I think this in a lot of ways is worse. It wouldn't be too bad if you could reduce the amount of supporters the other side had earlier on. Like, say, before you get to 50, it can cost, 1,000 gold to reduce it, but then it would trivialize it. To be clear, this is the problem with the supporter system. It's only really a challenge once you get to level 1, and then once you get to level 1, the AI faction, your AI opponent, be it Catherine or Castalten, dependent on who you're playing against, will fall behind. So the AI gets significant bonuses early on, ridiculous ones, especially Castalten himself, because of all the battles he's fighting, and because it does seem like the AI is hard-coded to get supporters for all of these actions, like, supporters when constructing a holding, supporters when gaining character rank, supporter when fighting a battle. Though it does feel like the one Castalten has permanently on is Tor, which gives him supporters when fighting a battle. Is, however, really, really frustrating given the way the AI cheats, blatantly cheats with that. It was annoying with Paris and Hector. It is just as annoying here. And another issue is the devotion itself. It can be hard getting devotion. This really shows you the limits of Kislev as a race that worked decently well, though it had plenty of issues even there, but worked decently well in the Realms of Chaos campaign, but doesn't work all that well in a campaign in Immortal Empires, because you can only really get a lot of devotion by fighting Chaos armies, be it Norskins, Chaos Warriors, Demons. That's how you gain a lot of devotion. Yes, there are events. Yes, there are ways of reducing it, right? There's an event that reduces the cost by 50% that can last 20 turns. That's ridiculously powerful. But by and large, it can be tricky getting these invocations going. However, you pretty much want to have it up 100% of the time, in the early game at the very least, if you're going to win the supporter race. So this whole system is just in a really bad spot. It made some sense, but it wasn't in a good spot in Realms of Chaos. Being translated in Immortal Empires just doesn't work all that well. That's one aspect. And this ties into your into your settlements as well. Because in order to gain supporters, one of the best ways is to get chapels and go from shrine to chapel to church and get supporters through that. And pretty much you're going to be incentivized in holding a lot of these chapels and churches in order to really gain a large number of supporters. Not for any other benefit, you're literally just constructing them for the supporters, not the control, not the devotion. Hell, not even the patriarchs. The patriarchs are certainly useful heroes. No, the primary reason is because you want to win the supporter race. That's one aspect. The settlement issue affects their economy because the settlements in Kislev are pretty awful. Your economy is not necessarily in a really good spot. If you hold the 3 big cities, though, you are going to be in a pretty decent spot. Though, keep in mind, obviously, one of them is going to start in the hands of your political opponent. One of them can be up for grabs if you do go to war with Prague and take it over. And Prague can certainly be useful because you can get the structure that gives you a significant global recruitment benefit and also gives you recruitment of Streltsy. So yeah, the Citadel of Prague can be an amazing structure. Beyond that, though, there's also issues with their army roster. So from the main settlement structure, actually, let's just look at minor settlement. From the main settlement of a minor settlement, you can only get costers. From something like Erengrad, you can get dervishes, right? From some other places, though I believe it's really only Erengrad that gives you dervishes. Kislev itself will only give you Kossars. But generally, you're only going to be able to recruit Kossars unless you have a military barracks. And even a military barracks, if we look at the building browser, is not going to change all that much because the main military chain, Al level... not that one. The main military chain is only going to give you Kossars with spears. So pretty much the same thing, except they are better against cavalry and large units. It's only at tier 2 that you get some other options, and they're not even that great to begin with, because armored Kossars, yeah, they're pretty decent melee units, though they're not the best. Kislev really suffers from the fact that a lot of their units have hybrid roles. So Kossars are meant, though they don't do it very well, I can tell you that much, but Kossars are meant to be a unit that's both a ranged unit and a melee unit. They're horribly in melee, and they're not the best range, though they are quite capable of holding their own as a ranged unit. Cavalry-wise, and the other issue is that you won't be able to get any other units except Kossars and armored Kossars, unless you're counting the horse archers and dervishes, which are absolutely terrible. You won't really be able to get anything else from your settlements except Kossars and armored Kossars until you get to tier 3. Some factions get really strong units at tier 2. Some factions get really strong units in tier 1, if you're talking about the Warriors of Chaos. You get Kossars. That's it. Kossars and armored Kossars. Now, once you get going, yes, you do have things like Snow Leopards, War Sleds, right? The Winged Lancers, Streltsy, Tsar Guard, Griffin Legion, Ice Guard in particular. You do have those options, but looking at the roster, these are all of the units you can recruit at Kislev. No more than this. It is an incredibly limited roster that just isn't that great. Yes, you can make a Kossar Doomstack. Well, I hope you like Kossars, because that's pretty much all you're going to do if you're playing as Kislev. Targar are okay, but they're not that great, and they're not worth recruiting in very large numbers. War sleds might work, but they do require tier 3. Though you can make war sleds work, especially if you have the trait that reduces the upkeep of them, and you can make an earth war sled and heavy war sled Doomstack. Could absolutely work, because there is a trait to reduce the upkeep in an army by 50%. That is absolutely possible, especially if you train an Ice Witch Lord and get that trait through the training. You could make that work very well. But your army options are going to be incredibly limited. And Kossars do have issues, significant ones at that. They're okay range units, but they're weak against armor. And so if you meet someone that has a heavily armored army, you're just going to get splattered on the floor. The issue is they just have major gaping holes in their army roster. Although Kislev's roster on tabletop was, of course, fairly limited, I think that it does take them too long to get to some of the good units. Their economy doesn't necessarily support those good units in large numbers. That's another issue. And although Kislev does have really good heroes, they just don't have the armies to go along with it. Especially considering where they are, right? It's not like Kislev has a vacation spot of a campaign start. No, they have a hellish start. Like, be it Costin or Catherine, even Boris Ursus, though he can certainly make his own work very well. They don't have an easy start. They're fighting against a lot of foes from the very start, and they don't necessarily have the tools to do that in the most effective manner. Can you win? Yeah, sure. If you play in a very specific way, you can take out Azazel, you can take out Front, you can face the hardest early game challenge in the entire game. But that's because limitations, bad terrain work, bad army, limited economy, limited settlements, an annoying supporter system, it all adds together. It is a sad state of affairs, but the thing is, Kislev is not the only race that was actually introduced in Warhammer 3, and now in Immortal Empires finds itself in a serious need of a rework. In fact, pretty much all of the races, all of the legendary lords, with the exception of Grand Cafe, need a rework, major sweeping changes to actually work in Immortal Empires. Maybe the ogres just need more camps, or some tweaks to camps, and that could work. But every single one of the races that was introduced in Immortal Empire needs a rework, because this is what happens when you create a faction or race for a more limited campaign and then just copy and paste them in a far wider world, in a far wider campaign, and then do a pretty poor job, honestly, with the way their minor settlements work. Your best bet might actually be to conquer the Empire, which is supposed to be your ally. I'm not joking on this. The Empire has great settlement types. For all the issues the Empire might have, they have some really, really great settlements. There's a gold mine in Aslan. Like, if you take out Aslan, take out Festus as either Catherine or Costalton, you'll get going. You'll have an economy. You'll have something to work with. If you try and fight with Kislev, that's just a waste of time. The problem is you don't really have that flexibility to do that, because guess what? You need to fight Chaos to get the devotion, which you need for supporters. And you can't just ignore Azazel, Trog, and Frot, because they're just going to annihilate you if you try and do so. So yeah, plenty of issues with the way Kislev works right now, with the way their campaigns are designed. The problem is, I'd say the fundamental problem from my perspective, beyond the army issues, the settlement issues, etc., Kislev should really have a more defensive-oriented campaign. Think of the Wood Elves. Like, the Wood Elves are the only defensive-oriented campaign in the entire game, because they can focus on just playing pure defense because of their settlements, strong economy, and a few select settlements, and because of the way their objectives work. You can't do that as Kislev, even though you should be doing that as Kislev, because that's what they are in the lore. From my perspective, they're the shield of the North. They're the guys who hold their ground. They're not the conquerors of the Chaos Wastes and Norska. They're the guys who are barely holding it together against those fellows. And that's what I think should be changed with regards to Kislev. Not the Civil War supporter stuff that's happening right now. Not this campaign style where you are being pushed to aggressively expand, because the best way to earn supporters is to invoke Urson and take a lot of settlements. But that's where we stand with Kislev right now. To move on, let's talk about the Demon Prince and the Demons of Chaos in general, because they all suffer from the very same problem. Every single legendary lord of the Demons of Chaos is based heavily around the gimmick. For the Demon Prince, it's the body parts and the various favors that you can unlock with the Chaos Gods by building support, by building glory with them. For Khorne, for Skarbrand, it's the blood hosts and raising Salamans going from battle to battle. For Tzeentch, it's the changer of ways. For Nurgle, it's plagues. And for N'Kari, it's cults and forced vassalization. That's fine. In fact, some of the best campaigns in the world, in the game right now, in Immortal Empires, are heavily based on a gimmick or another. Like Clan Eshin, for instance, having the assassination contracts. Frot having the mutagens. Archaon having the vassals and significant benefits from that. However, here's the thing about those legendary lords, about Skaven, Warriors of Chaos, and other factions, races, and legendary lords, that beyond the gimmicks, beyond the unique mechanics, if you will, they have a strong base to work on, which is what's utterly lacking for the Warriors of Chaos. Sure, N'Kari can get very far, so can Skarbrand. Tzeentch may struggle, and Kugath absolutely does struggle, so does the Demon Prince. But they don't. But if their plan doesn't work out, like if Skarbrand just loses a battle, he's finished, right? Whereas with some of the strongest factions, you can lose a lot of battles and still recover and just keep going, and it's not really a problem. So the problem is, for the Demon Prince in particular, but for Skarbrand as well, and for others as well, their economy, their ability to recruit very large armies from the very start is incredibly weak. Yes, once you get an economy going, you get a very large empire, yes, it can work out. But for instance, take the Demon Prince. I've taken the Fortress of Decay, and all I really have for an economy is a structure for 100 income. This is incredibly weak, and I don't really have any great options of recruitment. We can also talk about the fact that the Demon Prince is heavily dependent on the Warriors of Chaos DLC to be able to get some special Marauder units, though not if you dedicate yourself to Slaanesh and get in turn get devoted Marauders of Slaanesh. But if you dedicate yourself to Khorne, for instance, yeah, you can only recruit Chaos Furies if you don't have the DLC. Problems, limitations, issues, plenty of problems, bad design. The Demon Prince was already in a bad spot. In fact, many of the demonic factions were already in a bad spot. Yes, people could cheese their way with Kairos, could smash their opponent's Skarbrand, but all of them had major significant issues with the Realms of Chaos, and that continues to apply in Immortal Empires. What do I think needs to be changed with them? Well, I think that the demonic factions just need a stronger economy. Just need the ability to be able to get more armies far easier than relying on conquering a vast amount of territory. Because for me to maintain 2 armies, the Greens can maintain 5 or 6 in the same kind of territory. Warriors of Chaos pretty much on the same level. Let alone someone like Rom the Punch, as an example, who can probably maintain a heck of a lot more because he can print money. And therein lies the issues. Because you're just going to have a much slower, harder, harsher, more boring actually campaign than you would otherwise. Because if you can expand quickly, you can finish the campaign faster. And finishing the campaign faster means that you're not spending 100, 200 turns just waltzing around the world fighting pointless battles that you can't lose because your armies are unstoppable. So yeah, the Demons of Chaos are not really in a good spot right now. None of them are. People can talk all they want about N'Kari and Skarbrand. I've played campaigns as N'Kari and Skarbrand, and yeah, you can make it work, but let's not deny the issues that do exist. The Demon Prince has the worst of all of them because he starts out incredibly weak and pathetic, and it's going to take you a very, very long time, regardless of what you do, to get in a good position. Maybe the best piece of advice would just to leave the Chaos Wastes and head over to Norska and conquer Norska, because at least you're going to have the undivided corruption over there as opposed to your starting province, which is Nurgle corruption, and the provinces next door, which are Tzeentch corruption. You want undivided corruption. There are ways to make it work, I know, but there's a reason why there's very few people playing this campaign as it is right now, and it's just in a really, really bad space at the moment. For all of the Demons of Chaos, all of their campaigns have major issues as things currently stand right now. Surprisingly, the one who might have the best situation would actually be Kairos, because for all the issues he might have, at least he can get some things going. Unlike Nakari, who's fighting 3 legendary lords from the very start, pretty much. Then we get to the Empire. The Empire is in a sorry state in Warhammer 3, for good reasons. The Imperial Authority system is not in a good spot, the Prestige system also not in a good spot, the dilemmas that spawn for it, not in a great spot. On top of that, what's even worse than all of that is that you're supposed to keep the entire empire together, right? That would make sense in a campaign. The problem is you don't have the diplomatic tools to achieve that, because all you can do with the electro counts is get non-aggression pacts, trade agreements, and military access. You can't make a military or defensive alliance. That means you can't replenish an electro count territory. You can't use the war coordination system. Creative Assembly added the tools necessary to potentially deal with a campaign like this, except you can't actually use them if you're playing as Karl Franz or Balthazar Gelt over here in Solent. So yeah, there's gonna be a lot of problems playing campaign as Gelt or Karl Franz. What about Marcus Wolfhard? Well, he doesn't have the Imperial Authority system, but he has a lot of issues with the hostility system. Even though he actually is the best legendary lord of the Empire. And Volkmar, well, Volkmar gets screwed because he starts in the Southlands, so even though he doesn't have either the hostility meter or the Imperial Authority system in terms of campaign mechanics, he's actually in the best spot of all of them. And he can gain a lot of power through the Books of Nagash. The issue is he is in the Southlands, which carries with it a lot of issues. So yeah, lots of problems with the Empire from that perspective. Another issue is in the way the Empire works. See, the Empire is a faction that gets stronger the more you play them. And that, however, is an issue because their start is incredibly weak. You can only train archers and spearmen from your basic settlements, and archers require the Beast and Hunter DLC from Warhammer 2. So if you don't have that DLC, the Empire is going to be significantly weaker in the early game. Sure, you can rely on getting crossbows instead, but they're gonna be more effective. They're gonna be more expensive, rather. They are going to be more effective, but more expensive at the same time than the archers, and you just won't have the early game economy to support a very large number of units of crossbowmen. Another issue for the Empire is that what makes them good in the mid-late game is their wide variety of heroes, be it captains, warrior priests, or eventually getting mages. All of that is great with the different schools of magic, and warrior priests in particular are really good as heroes because of their ability, but it does take a lot of going to get there. So for instance, in Altdorf, where you start, if you're playing Karl Franz, it takes until tier 3 to start getting a warrior priest, and you will only be able to get one for each structure there, or one imperial captain. They do have some benefits when it comes to captains as Karl Franz. And to get battle wizards, you need tier 4, at least over here. So yeah, there are quite a few issues with the way the Empire starts going. When they get going and when they start getting things like Hellstorms at tier 4 and Demigryphs, and obviously you get handgunners and greatswords and all that, they are in a good spot, but it does take them really tier 4 until they unlock their full military potential. And that is a problem because it means they're far weaker in the early game. I think the Empire needs better tools in the early game than they currently have. And that would make them much better at dealing with the myriad of threats that they have. It's not like any of the Imperial campaigns, with the exception of Wolfheart. It's not like any of them is going to have an easy road ahead of them. They're all very difficult campaigns, and the current way the race works holds them back. Finally, we get to the Dwarves. The first thing that Dwarves really desperately needs changed is this meter over here at the top. the grudge meter, which is pretty much going to always be full for many of the dwarf legendary lords. So if you're playing Ungrim, if you're playing Forik, if you're playing Belagar, and even if you're playing Forgrim, though he has a decent enough chance at clearing it, but even if you're playing Forgrim, you're likely going to play at least some portions of your campaign, if not substantial portions of the campaign, with it full. Actually, if you're playing as Forik, you're pretty much going to play the entire campaign with it full, because he starts with a lot of grudges, and already by turn 20, these grudges have reached an intensity of 24. That is ridiculous, and you get significant downsides by this meter filling up. You do get significant upsides if you can deal with the grudges, though honestly, considering what it takes to deal with all the grudges, it's actually not worth it. I mean, free control, minus 10% construction cost. You know what the dwarves need? They need growth. Because beyond the grudge meter, which affects your public order, research, and diplomatic relations with fellow dwarves by a substantial amount, you also have really, really bad growth. You have bad public order because of the grudge meter, you have bad growth by default, and bad public order affects that even further. So do expect to be at a significant disadvantage when it comes to growth. So if you have really bad public order, you get minus 20 growth. You can expect this to actually happen quite often, more often, or at least minus 10 or minus 15. Which means that getting to a high tier to unlock your good units can be an absolute nightmare. To unlock more building slots to have a variety of buildings is an absolute nightmare. See, people say, oh, the dwarves should work as a slower race, and I'm like, well, Warhammer 3 just doesn't work like that. Not being able to expand the settlement here is a significant downside, because it means you can't get heroes, you can't get the engineer, you can't get the runesmith, you can't get the Thane. And you do end up having significant downsides because of that very specific situation. Now, what do I think is a solution to this? Well, I think the dwarves could use something like a Dark Fortress system. I wouldn't say they need a defensive-oriented campaign, because they do want to retake their territory and settle grudges. I wouldn't say they need the defensive-oriented campaign as the Wood Elves, but they could certainly use types of settlements that are like Dark Fortress, that could have a lot of slots, that could grow faster, just those settlements in particular. And then the minor settlements could be as they currently are, where it takes a long time to actually grow them. But the various Crix could be substantial settlements, because you know what, although the dwarves are limited in the lore and they're constantly besieged, the reason they're so diminished and limited in the lore is not because they're not trying, it's because they're constantly under threat by a large number of greenskins, Skaven, etc. That's the case in this game, but they don't have the holds that characterize the race in the lore, because dwarven holds are supposed to be pretty much impregnable, the ones that have still survived. Sure, Carrick 8 Peaks fell, and it was one of the greatest ones, but that basically took an unholy alliance between Skaven and Greenskins to make it happen. But by and large, the dwarven cities, the main ones, should be pretty much impregnable, and yet they're not. They're just regular cities that don't have any difficult garrisons to deal with, that are just plain old regular cities, so they could really benefit from a system similar to Dark Fortresses. They could benefit from special income structures, as Kislev has in their settlements, or the Warriors of Chaos have in their settlements, in those kind of specific settlements. And that would make a lot of sense for the dwarves, I feel, personally. And yes, I think the grudge meter needs to be changed. It shouldn't be like just, oh, if you have a lot of grudges, you get a lot of downsides. That's not how the dwarves should work, because if that's how the dwarves should work, they should go completely insane, because they have an insane amount of grudges in their race. I feel like balancing the grudge meter should be important, and it should be part of their race. But I also feel that you should get different benefits, I'd say, for your campaign, depending on where this meter stands. So let's say you get it too far full, then well, you might get the benefit. You may not have the strongest economy, but you may get the benefit to, say, recruiting units to settle the grudges. But if it's empty, you get some benefits to growth, to income, public order, what have you. By the way, you should have benefits. I mean, consider the greenskins. The greenskins, as they're filling up their WoW meter, get substantial benefits in growth and control. You don't have that. You just have downsides if this meter fills up. Oh, you can recruit Slayers, except Slayers are just not really good units unless you're playing Ungram. They're just not good units. They're very, very expensive to recruit. So yeah, the Dwarves do suffer. Now some people will point out, well, you can recruit all the good units at tier 4. They changed that. You don't no longer need tier 5. Yeah, but it's still a pretty miserable situation when you look at it. It is nice that you can get tier 2 artillery with bolt throwers and grudge throwers, and you do have a pretty powerful army with quarrelers, but you're not going to be able to maintain more than 1 or 2 armies regardless of what you're trying, regardless of the legendary lord you're playing, which is going to severely limit your campaign reach and expansion. So yeah, it is a problem, and it's something that absolutely needs to be fixed. Costin, you're signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and I'll see you next time.